Over the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about the fact that if we lived in a different universe, we would have a new Avengers movie in theaters right now. Avengers Kang Dynasty was announced in July 2022 alongside Avengers Secret Wars. The original intention was to give us 2 Avengers movies in 1 year, with one releasing in May and the other in November. Now, there are a few different reasons why exactly this didn't happen, but the biggest offender all lies within Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in today's video. How Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania nearly kneecapped the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Before we get started with today's topic, I just wanted to point out that if you have any questions you want us to answer in a future video, leave it in the comments below with the hashtag mailbag. I try to respond to most questions that are left in the comments, but of course some slip through the cracks, so if you have a question that you really want answered and don't mind it being on screen in a future video, leave it down below with the hashtag mailbag. Quantummania was first announced back in December of 2020 at Disney's Investor Day. Previously, it was rumored that Kang the Conqueror would be the big bad of the movie, with Jonathan Majors coming hot off the back of Lovecraft Country being eyed as the top choice for the role. Now, December 2020 was a really weird place for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Phase 4 had yet to begin, and we had an entire year without a single MCU entry due to the ongoing pandemic. Had everything gone to plan, Black Widow, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Eternals would all have released at this point. But as we know from behind-the-scenes information, Marvel was still riding the high following the release of Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home. They knew the audience was waiting in anticipation for the next batch of Marvel projects, and when they weren't able to release what they had, they decided to start announcing more. Meanwhile, when we look over at Disney's other big brand, Lucasfilm, The Mandalorian Season 1 and now Season 2 having just finished were major successes for Disney+. But a $10 a month subscription fee is not as enticing as the possibility of having a billion-dollar movie, leading to the announcement of Marvel's next big tentpole movie, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. And this was Marvel's first big mistake. In terms of success, the first 2 Ant-Man focused movies did well with fans and critics, and were both relatively successful given the budgets they had. But a big factor in the success of those movies from the box office is that they came off the back of an Avengers release. The first Ant-Man released right off the back of Avengers Age of Ultron, and the second right in between Infinity War and Endgame, which were both billion-dollar successes for Marvel Studios. Now, there was an increase in revenue from the first Ant-Man movie to the second, but it wasn't that significant of a jump. They were still considered financially successful for Marvel Studios, with a big contributing factor being the fact that these were much smaller in budget compared to some of the other juggernauts Marvel was releasing at the time. So why would they give Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania the biggest budget that any Marvel Studios film had had up until that point? That's higher than Wakanda Forever, Civil War, it's higher than Avengers Endgame. And this is what they were considering the next must-see movie in the lead up to releasing the next Avengers movie. I don't understand how they could make such a critical mistake with this character. I remember when the first Ant-Man was releasing and everybody was speculating it was going to be Marvel's first big bomb. Why would anybody want to see a movie about Ant-Man? But it ended up working out because, as I said, Marvel kept the budget small and they delivered a movie that was a lot of fun. It didn't need to be a $200 million event film. A movie titled Ant-Man should be, no pun intended, a small stakes caper. So without talking about even the quality of the movie so far, you could see how this was always destined to fail. It's possible that maybe Marvel just anticipated that people were really excited to get back in movie theaters following the pandemic, or maybe they just really overestimated how much people liked Paul Rudd as Ant-Man following the release of Avengers Endgame. And of course, this resulted in Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania being a box office disappointment, with its performance being the first signs that Marvel Studios needed to make some big changes. But those are just the financials. We haven't even talked about what was wrong with the movie yet. Well, I think the budget plays into a big key factor of what's wrong with the overall story of Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. And I've talked about the main problem I have with Quantumania quite a few times. This feels like a completely different movie than the other 2 Ant-Man movies. Something I really admire Marvel Studios for for is their ability to maintain supporting casts when it comes to their solo movies. Tony Stark's supporting cast carries over movie to movie, same with Doctor Strange, the Guardians, even Spider-Man. And I think one of the strongest aspects of the Ant-Man movies is the supporting cast of Scott Lang's friends, who are completely absent in Quantummania and instead replaced with a group of totally forgettable side characters. And that's at no fault to the actors or performers in these roles. David Dastmalchian even returns as a completely different character, but isn't as interesting as the one he played in the previous two movies. Not to mention the fact that you cast Bill Murray, somebody who doesn't typically do movies like this, and you don't give him anything interesting or funny to do. I've said it before, but I think my ideal version of this movie is that they completely lose the Ant-Man suits, give the characters some limitations while they explore this really strange land, and maybe send Scott Lang's friends there also. Give us some things we recognize from the earlier two movies to make this more consistent as a trilogy, instead of having two standalone movies and then boom, we're in an Avengers prelude, which is ultimately what this movie feels like, and now it's completely pointless given the fact that we don't even have Kang the Conqueror coming back anymore. Which brings our next big problem that technically Marvel couldn't have predicted: Jonathan Majors and his legal troubles following the release of Quantumania. Now, before the movie came out, I was a fan of Jonathan Majors as an actor. I thought he did a great job in Loki Season 1 as He Who Remains, and it made me excited to see what he was going to be able to do as the big bad of the multiverse saga. But of course, he was found guilty in 2023 for a number of crimes that I'm not going to discuss here. Those were pretty heavy charges, and I feel like I'm not qualified enough to talk about them on a Marvel-centric YouTube channel. But the aspect of that that's relevant to our discussion is that it led to his firing from the MCU. Now, it's unknown why Marvel didn't ultimately decide to recast, but I feel like all of the information I've already talked about up to this point led to them going away from Kang as an antagonist. But there is speculation that Majors had it in his contract that only he would be allowed to portray Kang in any variant of the character in the future. But I don't know how relevant that is to the discussion given the fact that Marvel fired him, so that contract is essentially voided. All of this led to Loki Season 2 essentially closing the door on Kang the Conqueror being the threat for the MCU in the foreseeable future. And I have to say, I think that they are making the right steps in choosing Doctor Doom as the next villain of this saga. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is an interesting combination of Marvel having severe oversight issues while being completely unprepared for something to happen that was entirely out of their control. The biggest thing to walk away from this movie, though, is to make sure Marvel never makes these mistakes again. We've seen them kind of dip their toes into the same issues with movies like The Marvels having an extremely large budget and ultimately slowing down the output of the movies and shows they're going to be releasing. But I think the most important lesson for Marvel to learn from this is that they can't rely on a smaller character like Ant-Man to be a massive draw for audiences to go see and rely on them getting the biggest element of the story that they're going to need to know for the future of the Avengers. And I think the biggest damage that this has done is to the Ant-Man movies as a whole. Ant-Man 4 is probably never going to happen. Even Michael Douglas earlier this week said he has no plans to return to the MCU ever again. Initially, he said he would come back if his character was killed off in a future movie. He wanted Hank Pym to have some heroic sacrifice moment in Quantumania, and that fell on deaf ears also. So ultimately, going forward, the only future I see for Ant-Man and the Wasp is in Avengers movies, or potentially seeing the Young Avengers kick off with Cassie Lang on the team. But that's gonna wrap it up for today's video. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about everything I had to say here, and I will see you in the next video.